I'm Ken Bamberger, the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Professor of Law here at UC Berkeley, and the co-faculty director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies.
He's just a friend.
Excuse me? And I want to welcome you to the 5th Annual Levitsky Lecture on Israel and the Great Powers with Yuval Shany, the Hersch Lauterpacht Chair in International Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Today's conversation between Professor Shany and Koret Visiting Professor Masua Sagiv will explore the complex relationship between Israel and the UN, and it's part of a series in which previous lectures have examined Israel-China relations, those between Israel and Russia, Israel and Turkey, and Israel and Iran. And earlier today, Professor Shany also met with students over lunch to discuss these topics in a personal and interactive setting. So thank you. The Levitsky Lecture on Israel and the Great Powers was established with gift funding from the Levitsky Family Foundation. And we're grateful to Moses Levitsky and the Levitsky Family Foundation for this generous gift in support of our programming and this lecture, which has become a mainstay for the Helen Diller Institute every year. This year we're also pleased to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Miller Institute for Global Challenges in the Law here at Berkeley Law, and the university's Institute for International Studies. A word about the Helen Diller Institute. Through our two programs, one on Jewish law and one on Israel studies, the Helen Diller Institute provides a rich academic forum for students and for faculty. Currently, we house an undergraduate fellowship of nearly 40 students. We bring visiting faculty from Israel and US universities to teach and research at Berkeley. We host the university's undergraduate minor in Israel studies and offer dozens of lectures and programs, including some public programs like this one. And I do want to note that we have 3 other public programs this spring. Diller Institute Visiting Professor Yael Segalowitz on April 2nd will interview and speak with Israeli author Maya Arad. And then on April 30th, Israeli author Sarai Shavit. On April 22nd, we are excited to host leading Israeli journalist Nadav Eyal, who will talk about Israel on the ground. Tonight, we're honored to welcome Professor Yuval Shany as our distinguished Levitsky lecturer. Professor Shany, as I mentioned, the Hersch Lauterpacht Chair in International Law and the former Dean of the Law Faculty at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He also serves as a Senior Research Fellow at the IDI, the Israeli Democracy Institute, Visiting Professor in the Center for Transnational Legal Studies at King's College London, and Research Fellow at the Ethics in AI Institute in Oxford. Particularly relevant for tonight, he was a member of the UN Human Rights Committee between 2013 and 2020, chairing the committee for 2 of those years. And on a personal level, has been an extraordinary host to me and so many others at Hebrew University during what's been a complicated set of last few years. So I'm personally extremely grateful and grateful to have you as a friend. Yuval Shany will be in conversation with Masua Sagiv, the Koret Visiting Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at the Helen Diller Institute. Professor Sagiv is also senior faculty at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And her scholarly work explores the role of law, of state actors, of civil society, of religion in promoting social change across a whole set of diverse issues. Prior to coming to the Bay Area, Professor Sagiv was the academic director of the Menomadin Center for Jewish and Democratic Law at Bar-Ilan University. Please, everybody, join me in extending a really warm welcome to Professor Shany and Professor Sagiv.
Thank you so much, Ken. And thank you, everyone, for coming to this conversation today. Welcome to this conversation. The topic of Israel and the UN is a very broad topic. It's a very broad issue. Even when we're speaking about the UN, what exactly are we speaking about? We will talk, hopefully, in the next hour and a half about some history, some context, some texture about the relationship between Israel and the UN. And hopefully we'll also get to some of the conceptions and perceptions of international law. Maybe we'll even talk about the global order a bit. For starters, when we're speaking about the relationship between the UN and Israel, it seems appropriate to start at the beginning. The UN Resolution 181 from November 29, 1947 decided on creating two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state, and it was the basis for the establishment of the State of Israel. So can we start with a bit of history or even context about the relationship or the role that the UN played in the inception of Israel? And more than the history, why was it important?
Thank you, Masua, and I want to also join you in thanking the good folks in the Diller Institute, Ken, Rebecca, and the rest of the team and the Lubetsky family for supporting this, and all of you for coming here tonight. It's really an honor to be here. Like Masua said, this is a very heavy topic, which is multifaceted and also is really wrapped both in history and law and politics, but also a lot of emotions. So we will try to get through this in one piece. So the question of history, maybe before 47, I will allude to two other pieces of history that precede 47. One is 1920, 1922. I mean, when we are talking about Zionism as a self-determination movement, even before we were very familiar with the term self-determination, but the idea of Zionism was to create some national home, some political framework for the Jewish people. And within Zionism, as you know, there was, from the very get-go, from Herzl actually, even before 1920, there was this idea that in order to succeed, because, you know, the Jews were so dispersed, so weak, so persecuted, for them to succeed, they need the support of the big powers. They need the support of at that time, the international community. And Herzl did go from one emperor to the other, trying to convince them, to persuade them, to appeal to them, to support their plight. And as you know the story, this campaign succeeds eventually after, at the end of World War I, when the world map, especially in the areas that were controlled by the empires that lost the war, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, and to some extent the Russian Empire, those areas of the world are being redivided, and suddenly there is a golden opportunity. I mean, all the pieces in the puzzle suddenly come together, and the Zionists, and at that time it was no longer Herzl, of course, it was Weizmann at the forefront, the first president of Israel, and they are able to appeal to the British government in one trajectory, but also to the Allies, and get their support behind the project of establishing a Jewish home in Palestine. And that project is obtaining a political imprimatur in 1920 in an international conference the San Remo Conference, which was dealing with the post-World War I order. And for us international lawyers, it's important to know that in 1922, this plan received a legal order, a legal recognition through the Mandate for Palestine, which is in the creation of Israel, probably the least discussed, but the most important least discussed event in the history leading up to the creation of Israel. This was a point in time in which the international community, as it existed at the time, gave its full political and legal support to the project of establishing what was called at the time a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. There are many qualifications, and we can discuss what is a national home and what it means in Palestine, and what were the rights of the indigenous Palestinian Arab population, which was discussed in that resolution, so they were not forgotten. But without that 1922 resolution, there wouldn't have been a state of Israel. And the League of Nations is the precursor to the UN. So the United Nations picked up from where the League of Nations ended, and the events leading up to the partition resolution in 1947 and the admission of Israel to the United Nations in 1949, it's part of one long continuum of events, which is actually a remarkable victory for the Zionist movement. Basically, acceptance of the idea that the community of nations endorses the claim of Zionism, and basically accepts, supports, and recognizes a Jewish state in Palestine, the state of Israel. And this is indeed a very remarkable success story. So when people are questioning, is Israel a legitimate state? It's probably one of the few states in the world whose existence obtained so much support in critical junctures towards its creation from the international community. So this is one part of the history which I wanted to contextualize leading up to the 1947 resolution, the partition resolution, and the 1949 admission of Israel into the United Nations. We also need to say something about the UN. The UN is, in a way, the closest thing that we have to a world government. It's not a world government, of course, but it is the closest thing that we have to a world government. It's an organization that was created after World War II in order to prevent World War III. This is why the UN was created. And you know the quip attributed to Einstein about not knowing how World War III would be fought, but knowing that World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones. Okay, so that was the imperative to try to create, after the terrible atrocities, the terrible violence, the terrible wars that the world has seen before, a new world order that is based on a number of pillars. And we'll talk about these pillars later on, but a critical pillar is restriction of the use of force, significant limitations on the ability to conduct wars, realization of the principle of self-determination, namely support for the right of people to create their own states, and what is called the friendly relations agenda, creating a platform for states to cooperate among themselves on a very broad variety of issues. The creation of the State of Israel was clearly understood as falling within the first and the second pillar. It was one of the first immediate challenges that the new United Nations confronted shortly after the establishment of the organization. And the idea here is you have a very difficult and complicated conflict in the Middle East, which coincides with the end of the British mandate on Palestine, which started in 1922. And there was an attempt with one strike both to deal with the source of the conflict, the political source of the conflict that is generating violence through an idea of separation, partition, a very Solomonic solution to a very difficult and intractable problem, but also realization of self-determination for the two peoples that were living in that area, the Israelis and the Palestinians, the Jews and the Palestinians, the Arab state and the Jewish state. So the creation of Israel is not a disconnected event from the very idea of what the United Nations was supposed to do to prevent wars and to realize self-determination. There was also idea in the partition plan that there would be economic cooperation between the two states. So this also actually fit with the third pillar of the United Nations. But maybe I'll stop here and return to you.
And I'm thinking we'll keep on talking about the relationship between the UN and Israel. But as we're speaking, I'm realizing we're saying the UN as if it's one body. And it is one body, but it's also an intricate system of a lot of different bodies. Some of them feel very biased. Some of them feel less biased, or maybe a more charitable way to say it would be professional versus political. Can you map for us a bit of these bodies? I assume not all of them, but the ones that are important for our conversation, and some of the challenges with the bodies that are that feel more political. Why do we need them for them to be political, or how they became so? And is there something that should be done or we want to be done about this?
Okay, thank you. So that's, of course, we can teach it at Berkeley or in other university. We can have at least a semester-long course on what is the United Nations, and so we're not going to do we're going to do the very short version of the course, the 2 minutes version of the course. So I will say, roughly speaking, the United Nations has a number of functions, and as a result, it has a number of configurations, a number of constellations in which it is exercising its different functions. It is first and foremost an interstate body. It is not a government of experts. Okay, it is not a council of philosopher kings, right, that descend on the world and share their wisdom. To say that the UN, how is the UN political? It is political because it is political. It is states which are political animals coming together in a room like this and basically discussing world issues. And of course, so there is no other way than being political. It's a political, so it would be like asking, is Senate political? Is the US Senate political? It is political because it's composed of politicians. Is the Israeli Knesset political? Yes, it is political. So the whole idea of the United Nations in that regard is getting states to come together and discuss problems, deliberate over problems, and come up with solutions, with agreements, persuasion, pressure, and you have a number of bodies that are designed to achieve exactly that. So you have this General Assembly. So this is the body where all states come together and denounce Israel. But they discuss world problems. And of course, as you can imagine, 193 states cannot solve anything, right? Because you have like the joke with the 5 Jews, 7 opinions. So 193 states, you have at least 500 opinions. It's very difficult to get any job done. Therefore, the idea was, let's create some smaller, still political bodies to deal with specific issues, and we will give those smaller bodies some more power. And the most important of these smaller political bodies is, of course, the Security Council, which is a small body, only 15 states. And among the 15 states, you always have 5 heavyweighters, which are called the permanent members of the Security Council. The US used to be the Soviet Union, now it's Russia, China, and for some historic reason, France and the UK, though they're certainly have long, outlived their existence as superpowers. But they're still there because it's impossible to change, almost impossible to change the UN Charter. And they actually are dealing with security emergencies, and they actually have some decision-making power. So as opposed to the General Assembly that makes a lot of decisions, but these are not legally binding decisions. So even the partition resolution is arguably not legally binding. And certainly other resolutions relating to Israel, which we may mention, like Zionism is racism, not legally binding. The Security Council can generate legally binding, but the threshold is high. You need a high majority, you need 9 out of 15, and you can't have any of the permanent members vote against the resolution. This is the famous veto power, which means that the decisions that were taken by the Security Council would be typically decisions that enjoy broad consensus. And on very controversial issues, and everything that has to do with Israel is controversial, it's almost impossible to get the Security Council to vote on something which is very significant. It has to be a very bad day in the relations between Israel and the United States for this to happen. Now, on top of these political bodies, and there are a few others which I will save you the details in the interest of time, there are also many what are called specialized agencies. And there is actually where this often operates below the radar, but this is where the UN does a lot of very important professional work. So a lot of the problems, when you don't know how to solve a problem, you often establish a committee. And the UN has actually reached really world-class expertise in kicking the can down the road and basically delegating responsibilities to more professional bodies, in which you would have the body that I sat on had human rights experts. So you could have a body dealing with climate change that has climate experts. And you will have an agency dealing with food and agriculture who would have people with expertise in those areas. And in the World Health Organizations, you would have experts in health policy, and the list goes on. And the idea would be to create, again, this is not world government because almost all of these bodies do not have real authority, but they do serve as what we sometimes call academics as focal points. They do generate certain accepted policies that are generally supported by professionals from all over the world, and that generates certain pressure on states also to come around and agree around this. And in the area of climate change, we have seen this work quite impressively. Not that the problem has been anything but solved, but at least we have now very broad consensus that climate change is real, and that we have to aim to cap global warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And all the policies that we have been seeing in the last 20 and 30 years around climate change have been basically driven by this professional input that was given by UN special agencies. And then there is the third part, and that is there is a very, I don't know if big, but there is a very considerable UN bureaucracy. So both of these political bodies and specialized agencies are supported by a small army of bureaucrats, of people who are career government officials at the UN. And a lot of the people that we are seeing, like the Secretary General, he's the head of the UN bureaucracy. And that is his main goal. He is not the ruler of the world, but he is the chief civil servant of the world, if you may. We don't have time, but I'll just mention that there is also one important aspect, and actually most of the budget of the United Nations doesn't go to neither the first, the second, or the third function which I've mentioned, or the constellation, but rather to peacekeeping, which is a specific line of operations that the UN has started in the 1940s, the late 1940s, and actually the first peacekeeping mission was designed with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in mind. And there has been since 1948 a UN peacekeeping force in Jerusalem, UNRWA. Sometimes the problem with the UN is once you establish a body, it's very difficult then to end its existence. Once it's there, it's always there. But the UN does have a very significant peacekeeping role in many conflict areas around the world. I don't know if we will have time to talk about this, but Israel has a UN peacekeeping force inside Israel. There is a peacekeeping force between Israel and Lebanon, UNIFIL. There is a peacekeeping force between Israel and Syria. There used to be a peacekeeping force between Israel and Egypt. So Israel was actually quite a significant client of peacekeeping services. There have been peacekeepers all around the world in many conflict areas, and in some of them, I mean, the UN has really been critical in stabilizing the situation. For instance, even in Israel, Syria, the existence of the UN for many years was a key element that maintained relative calm in that area since effectively 1973.
Does Israel welcome these specific peacekeeping bodies, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, peacekeepers can only operate in the territory of a state that had agreed to accept them. So this is not the kind of international intervention that is imposed on state. It's a sort of an international intervention that is either invited or accepted by states. And therefore, yes, and Israel does cooperate with these peacekeeping forces. I think it is less impressed with the performance, for instance, of UNIFIL. And did call to renew the mandate of UNIFIL, but it is not opposed to the existence of UNIFIL. It just wants it to do a better job in terms of implementing its mandate, which in the Lebanese context, it's not just keeping the peace, it's also ensuring that South Lebanon is demilitarized.
There is one body that you didn't mention. You've said that, of course, it's a political body because it's compiled of states that are political, but there is one area where it seems, at least for, I don't know how to define this, to Zionists, to Israelis, I'm not sure, where the UN is significantly biased, and that's in the body that is very exceptional and very unique to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's UNRWA. I don't know if you intentionally didn't list UNRWA in your former answer or not, but will you say a few words about UNRWA, and if you could also say why it is unique, and also, if you will, what do you think should be done about UNRWA?
Yeah, when you said there is a body which is which is biased against Israel, I thought of more than one. I was waiting for the end of your question. We could also talk about the Human Rights Council, which I didn't mention, and on the Commission for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, which is a special UN commission dealing with the rights of the Palestinian people. But yeah, I mean, UNRWA is really an interesting case because UNRWA does emerge in 1949. So it does emerge around the time in which Israel is created as part of the process by which the United Nations is trying to stabilize the Israel-Palestinian conflict. At that time it was called the Israeli-Arab conflict in Palestine. And one element of that attempt, we talked about the partition resolution in 47, and we talked about the 49 admission of Israel to the United Nations. But in between, in 1948, something else has happened, other than the establishment of the State of Israel. and that is the adoption by the General Assembly of a very important resolution, Resolution 194, which is what the Palestinians refer to as the right of return resolution. As we know, the war of 48, 49, 47, 49, there are different ways to describe that war, has resulted in a significant displacement of Palestinians from areas that have become the state of Israel. So many hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced, and there is, of course, a very long, and I'm not going to, we can discuss this later, but there is a very long debate as to how many of them were expelled by Israel, and how many left out of fear or because they were promised that they could return with the victorious Arab countries. Clearly, many were displaced. I don't think this is now in doubt. And in order to this created a series. So this created within the Middle East a new refugee problem over and beyond the serious refugee problem that existed in Europe after World War II. So while the UN was working on the Europe problem and eventually created in 1951 a specialized agency to deal with refugees in Europe, which was the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, which eventually expanded its mandate to the whole world. Then with regard to the Palestine problem, the General Assembly created as a sort of an emergency measure a specialized agency to deal only with the Palestinian refugees, only with the Arab refugees from Palestine, which is UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine, for Palestinian refugees. And the idea is to deal with those Palestinian refugees until they are allowed to return under the terms of Resolution 194. So the resolution envisioned a situation that at the end of the war, so the resolution is adopted while what the Israelis called the War of Independence is still ongoing. And the idea is that at the end of the war, the refugees would be able to return to their homes if they are willing to live side by side peacefully with the Jews. And if circumstances allow that, they will return. If it's practicable, so every word in this resolution, there is a mountain of literature on what it exactly means. But the idea is that the United Nations will try to get them back. And in order to keep that hope alive, they will create an agency that would look after them in the areas to which they escape, which is West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. And the resolution talked about a 2-year agency that would operate for 2 years. And here we are. Now, Masua, you mentioned that this is a biased organization. This is an organization that has a very specific goal, and the goal is to look after Palestinian refugees wherever they are. Now, Israel has, for many years, opposed to the existence or was extremely uncomfortable with the existence of UNRWA. And the reason is that after it became quite clear that the end of the war would not enable the return of the refugees for a variety of reasons, which we can discuss. For Israel, the continued existence of UNRWA and the continued conferral of refugee status under UNRWA for Palestinians and descendants of Palestinians and descendants of Palestinians, including Palestinians who are born in the West Bank, live in the West Bank, they're still considered under this constellation refugees because their grandparents or grandparents may have come from the 48 line. This was seen as the Israelis saw that and still see it as a sort of an arrangement that effectively perpetuates the 48 war, that doesn't allow any closure and retains or keeps alive a certain hope for people to return to houses which are either not there or have been for many years occupied by other people, and many of those, the vast majority of people who are now refugees under UNRWA, of course, never been in these houses. So the whole existence of a UN agency that is perpetuating a certain narrative which is really critical to a very difficult conflict was seen increasingly by Israel as not something that is conducive to maintaining peace in the area, but rather something that is blocking the possibility of finding a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, with the current war in Gaza, there have been specific allegations also of involvement of UNRWA workers in the 7 October attacks, and also other forms of complicity between UNRWA and Hamas, and that was for the current Israeli government, the last straw, leading Israel to basically cut off all ties with UNRWA, and that actually started a few weeks ago. So the law entered into effect a few weeks ago, and currently it's not clear whether UNRWA would be able to operate in all the territories that it is currently operating. In parallel, the United States, but some other countries as well have cut off funding to UNRWA. It's an agency that is supported mostly by what is called voluntary contributions. So this is not part of the regular UN budget. You need countries to donate funds for UNRWA for it to be able to provide the humanitarian services that it does. And I should say UNRWA does provide important humanitarian services, which maybe in an ideal world, the government of Lebanon or Jordan or Syria should have conferred to those people, but it is effectively funded by the international community, by UNRWA. The same would go for Gaza and the West Bank. But I think the future of UNRWA is now up in the air because of the combined effect of the Israeli decision to cut off ties with it and the major hit that its funding basis had received.
Although there were different campaigns, the Israeli government tried to campaign for different countries to stop funding UNRWA. It worked for a while, and then it seemed to countries returned to funding UNRWA. And also, there's something here that the Israeli government felt very uncomfortable, but it still cooperated with UNRWA, or at least allowed UNRWA to act and work within the territory. And also, it seems at least there are different voices even now after the law has passed that said that it is not really enforced. Can you speak to what is Israel's incentive to allow UNRWA, despite this being very uncomfortable and thinking this is a blocking source? And also, if you could, I tried to push you. Let's see if I could again. What do you think should be done with UNRWA? Is there an alternative? Should there be an alternative?
Right. So for many years, Israel was what we call in Hebrew yorim vebuchim. So Israel was very critical of UNRWA, but continued to cooperate with UNRWA. And the reason was very simple. There are millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And those individuals need basic services. They need food, they need education, they need jobs. And if it wouldn't be UNRWA that would provide them, it might fall on the shoulders of the Israeli government to do so. And if the Israeli government wouldn't do so, it may result in abject poverty in those areas and significant unrest. And the philosophy was that in order to maintain stability in the region, you need to look after the quality of life of the Palestinian people, and UNRWA played a positive part in preventing the Palestinians from basically being reduced to abject poverty. That was the philosophy. And therefore, for many years, Israel did collaborate with UNRWA and did allow UNRWA to operate and gave them visas and actually was working on a day-to-day basis while keeping all of the political concerns about what does it do in the long run for another day. I think at this point in time, it's a combined effect that, like I said, the involvement of UNRWA in the current war was seen as a bridge too far for Israel to accept. Both the involvement, but also I should say a very harsh criticism and a very harsh line that the UNRWA leadership took against Israel during the war, which is not so surprising. After all, it is a Palestinian agency. It's serving the Palestinians. Most of the workers are Palestinians. It is located in Palestinian territories. So it's not so surprising that they were much open to the Palestinian perspective. But Israel saw this as something that is not acceptable after what happened in October 7th. But it's also, I would say, part of the populism that we are seeing in many countries around the world. Also in Israel, that there are politicians who are promising to solve very complicated problems with very decisive action, which would imply withdrawal from this agreement, or shutting down this agency, or firing this bunch of civil workers, or in the case of Israel, cutting off all ties with UNRWA, and that will make the Palestinian problem go away. So those politicians are currently in power in Israel, and maybe in some other places around the world. And therefore, the UNRWA, the agenda against UNRWA did obtain significant backwing. And like you said, some countries did have second thoughts because they looked at the situation and they realized there is really no alternative at this point in time. But some countries, the United States, but also countries like Germany and the Netherlands and Switzerland, have decided that either immediately or gradually they're going to pull away from UNRWA, because I think there is a sense that this is an organization. I think what's troubling also for outside observers is that this is a classic case of an organization that is really exists due to the fact that there is a problem. And therefore, as long as there is a problem, it exists. So it has, in a way, an inbuilt incentive to perpetuate the problem. Yeah, it's like the joke with the lawyers that they never want a case to settle, because as long as the case is pending, there is a commission to be paid. So you do have this, I think, sense that UNRWA has been a bit stagnant, and also it does cost a lot of money, and this is an age in which countries are regardless cutting off international aid. And again, not only the United States, the UK has also cut drastically now its international aid, and UNRWA is probably not the most popular of agendas at this point in time. What should happen? So I think I will say. I will divide my answer. Gaza, I think, is a specific crisis that we currently have, and there will be, I believe, and I hope there will be a new government in Gaza, which will not be based on Hamas. I don't think there's going to be a Riviera in Gaza, but I think there is going to be a new government in Gaza, and within that government, and there will be a reconstruction plan within Gaza, and I'm not convinced that within such a configuration there is a clear urgency for UNRWA to be part of this new configuration. There will be some international reconstruction effort that can take the place of UNRWA. I think with regard to the Arab states, where you do have UNRWA operating Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, of course, all these countries have their own problems, but in the long run, I think it's a very regrettable situation that you have basically perpetual refugees in those countries who are actually encouraged and not to resettle in those countries. So the Palestinians in Lebanon, this is not something that a lot of people talk about, but they are heavily discriminated against. They're basically living in sort of a liminal state. They're neither here nor there, in terms of they're not Lebanese citizens. They don't have the full rights. I know that for coming from an Israeli, it sounds, well, what do you care? I mean, I do, but I think it's part of our tragedy that, Palestinians have been treated for many, many years as peons on a game, on a chess game, and their future has been completely instrumentalized by the international community and by neighboring countries. So the fact that you have an agency that keeps those people in this halfway arrangement, I think it's very bad for everyone. So I don't see a principled reason why UNRWA should continue indefinitely to support Lebanese refugees. They should be integrated or resettled or nationalized. The one country that did actually go in that direction was Jordan, that did confer its nationality to Palestinians. Of course, there are issues in terms of stability in Jordan, but there, I mean, they actually took the leap. They did resettle. With regard to Syria and Lebanon, they still live in refugee camps, so-called refugee camps. They're not really refugee camps. They're simply neighborhoods or villages that are called refugee camps, but they are in this very strange situation now we're talking about events that took place almost 80 years ago. This is unprecedented and doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I'm not an enemy of UNRWA. I think they have done over the years some important work, but I think we should start after almost 80 years to think of exit strategy.
Mm-hmm. There's a theme throughout this conversation about an international order that is consisted of states, and the mission of the UN and the goal of the UN, which is it was very interesting to hear you frame it as preventing World War III, which is not the way that we usually think about the UN, but there is a phenomenon, and we encountered it on October 7th, but it reflects other instances around the world of asymmetric conflicts, where there is a state involved and a non-state actor, in our case Hamas or Hezbollah. And the feeling that I think a lot of Israelis are having of this unfairness in treatment, and we have to fight with our hands tied behind our backs, where our enemy can do whatever they want because they have no limitations on them, is something that I feel is deeper than criticism or how politics or how global politics works, but something about the way that international law perceives war, perceives power, perceives the relations between states and non-state actors. Can you speak to this? Is there a crisis in international law, or is it international law? No one understands international law. What are we seeing in the past year and a half?
Yes, this is a complicated question. Let me try to unpack it a bit. So first, yes, we are in a very deep crisis in international law, and I think everyone, you mentioned in your introductory remarks, maybe we'll be talking about the international order. So political scientists often talk not about international law, but of a rule-based international order. And this is indeed what the UN Charter was designed to achieve. In 1945, it was basically designed to create a world order that is based on certain rules. Some of these rules are legal rules, but some of these rules are rules that are softer rules, are certain understandings, are certain ways of doing things. And I think we are seeing a collapse of that order. That order had, like I said before, that's certain elements. It had one important element, is that there should be no use of force between states across international borders. And we've seen that rule violated very seriously in recent decades. Of course, the Russian invasion to Ukraine was a very serious breach by one of the major shareholders, right? One of the P5. So this is not a case where you have a rogue state violating the charter. It's a case where you have a P5 state violating the charter, and the United States a decade before has also engaged in what most international lawyers would say was a serious violation of the charter when it invaded Iraq. So you have, within a relatively short period of time, you have one P5 country violating this, another P5 country violating the rule, and China may every day, what would be between China and Taiwan remains to be seen, although it is a bit more complicated legally speaking because it's not obvious that these are different countries. So there is this frontal challenge to the basic pillars of the world order that we have seen since World War II. And indeed, World War II, the UN, despite many concerns, despite many criticism, has been quite successful in preventing World War III and in preventing wars. There haven't been as many wars in the period after 45. There has been a sharp decline up to the point that, my Hebrew University colleague Yuval Noah Harari has made, I think, a bit of an overclaim, but he has claimed that this is the end of wars. We are living in an historical period where wars are no longer a phenomenon. They're a very rare phenomenon. He actually has the numbers. I think now in the new edition of the book of Sapiens, he may have to revisit that assertion, right? But I mean, we did have for many years relative stability. There were whole regions of the world where there were no wars at all for many decades. But this seems to be unraveling. And the other element which the rule-based order is based on, that we solve our problems through cooperation, through dialogue, through deliberation. But again, when you have leading countries going at it alone, basically taking an approach which is about unilateralism and deciding that, okay, we have a trade agreement, but we're not going to follow the trade agreement. And we're just going to impose tariffs on incoming trade because we want to do that, and it's in our national interest. The implication is that we are no longer conducting international relations on the basis of rules. We are back to where we were before World War II, where might makes right. And this is, of course, a very dangerous development and a very dangerous period to be at. I would say for small countries even more than for large countries. Now, the other part of your question dealt with this phenomenon of non-state actors. And indeed, the UN Charter actually, the UN is is an organization of states, and it does give states a seat around the table. If you're not a state, your ability to actually promote your interests through diplomatic channels is seriously compromised. I mean, if there were a few exceptions, the Palestinians were actually quite successful in getting a seat on the table, and the UN has recognized the state of Palestine in 2012. So we do have, although I don't consider Palestine to meet the legal criteria for a state, they are effectively treated as a state, and there have been other examples of entities few entities that have received in some international context a seat by the table. For instance, the Sahrawi, which are the people of Western Sahara and are currently occupied by Morocco. They have been admitted into the African Union. But these are very few and far in between examples. Generally speaking, it's good to be king and it's good to be state in international law. But it's true, and that's a point that you made, that international law, because it is built to regulate the relations between states, it has all sorts of assumptions, for instance, about how wars are conducted, which have the lawmakers had before them the idea of two states going to war, where both states have more or less similar interests, for instance, not mistreating POWs, prisoners of war. Because I would not want to mistreat your POWs because I don't want you to mistreat my POWs. So there is this idea of reciprocity. But when you have a terror organization or another non-state actor that is simply not following the rules, not interested in following the rules, there is a serious question of interpretation. How do you then take a treaty that was created to apply within states and implement it to a different situation? What you said is sometimes called an asymmetric conflict, and we've seen Gaza is an extreme case of an asymmetric conflict because you have a party that is not only interested in in violating the law, but is actually drawing the other party to violate the law vis-a-vis its own citizens, its own nationals, which is, I would say, almost unprecedented in the history of war, where a fighting party is actually encouraging civilian casualties on its side in the way it is conducting the hostilities. But I would say it's not a unique Israeli problem. The United States has faced asymmetric conflicts since 9/11. I mean, the war on Al-Qaeda was an asymmetric conflict. The war against ISIS was an asymmetric conflict. But in those contexts, I think there was certain acceptance that the rules need to be reimagined, readjusted, and at least the Security Council was supporting some of the measures that the United States had taken. With regard to Israel, there is this, I think, utilization of UN bodies in order to generate a narrative that not tries to bridge the distance between interstate war and asymmetric conflict, that actually accentuate the tension in order to put countries like Israel more on the violation side. And that is, I think, an unfortunate development because it would lead to ultimately to states not taking seriously international law. Because if international law doesn't provide real solutions to real problems, states would increasingly ignore it, especially in an environment where the whole rule of law is being questioned.
This is the last question before we go to the many, many, many questions that we have, and I see that more are coming. How do you explain this treatment? Is it anti-Semitism? Is it something else? How do you explain what you just described about this tendency to put Israel on the violating side or rubric?
Well, there is anti-Semitism in the world. This is not something that I think can be denied. But the UN is, like we said from the beginning, it's a political body. And there is in the Israeli conflict, I think we are seeing part of the tragedy of this conflict. Part of the reason why it is so difficult and almost intractable is not only that both parties have very good legal and moral claims. It's also because there is some reverse asymmetry in the state that Israel is very powerful militarily vis-a-vis the Palestinians, but very weak diplomatically. Because the Palestinians do have the support of most countries around the world for a variety of reasons, but most of which is that most countries in the world are developing countries. They associate themselves with the global South, who has been historically the victim of colonialism. And there is this strong sentiment that the Palestinian fight is the last colonial war, is the last, and in that regard, the Palestinians have been extremely successful in framing their plight, their struggle, their cause as a cause which is, if not straightforward, a colonial cause, anti-colonial cause. It's a cause that emanates from the same kind of issues and problems, and therefore every motion that the Palestinians and their allies would bring before a UN body, where states are sitting in plenary, they can get support for that. So there is maybe anti-Semitism in the background, and I think certainly the resolution on Zionism is racism. I see it as an anti-Semitic resolution. But there is also a very clever political game in which Israel has been, I think, failing to build coalitions. And of course, the fact that Israel is not free from, I mean, there is a lot of justified criticism that should be directed against Israel. Israel has been occupying Palestinian territories for decades and decades and decades without actually coming. I mean, there were periods when they were trying to do something, but for now, for at least for the last 15 years, there has been no serious attempt by Israel to resolve the situation, citing that this may be because Hamas is in Gaza and maybe because Abbas is corrupt. I mean, there are always excuses, but in the end, there is an untenable and I would say morally unacceptable situation that has been going on for many years. Also, other problems concerning human rights, etc. We're not going to do the whole internal soul searching now. But I think this certainly is not a great selling point to get international support when you are clearly not the good guy across the board. And I think Palestinians have less compunctions about, you know, on the one hand, I mean, it costs them less dearly politically to be on the one hand supporting violence and terrorism, but still being able to pursue their claim in international bodies. They've been much more successfully empirically, and they've been using probably the UN mechanisms in an extremely sophisticated ways, which Israel simply cannot match.
So as I said, we have received a lot of questions ranging on a lot of arrays. We'll see how many of them we'll manage to go over. The first is about other international bodies that are not part of the UN, but are very relevant to the Israeli international arena conversation, and that's the ICC and the ICJ. The judiciary, the international courts. Can you speak a bit about the proceedings, how you see them? I realize this is a very broad question. Maybe I'll direct it a bit more to a question which I think applies and maybe goes back to the first question that we discussed. Considering that there are an array of reasons why we think that we would not, Israel, I'm Israeli, but that Israel thinks that it would not receive a fair treatment. Should it participate in the proceedings or should it step back?
It's a good question. I mean, the ICJ is part of the UN. I mean, the ICJ is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, and this is part of this world order that we were talking about. You don't resolve problems through going to war. You resolve problems through deliberating, and in some cases going to court. The reason why I didn't emphasize it so much in my remarks up until now is that this is a court with limited powers, in the sense that it can only hear cases if both parties agree to appear before the court. So it's very different from a domestic court system where you can sue someone even if that person, which is typically the case, doesn't want to be sued. So in the UN court, the ICJ, you do have to accept, and therefore Israel cannot be sued on most issues that are on the table. You need to find a specific treaty which includes what is called a compromissory clause. That is a dispute settlement clause that says if we have disputes about this specific treaty, we can take the dispute before an international a court, like the International Court of Justice. And Israel has typically been quite careful not to sign treaties that have this provision. But every system has its, every rule has its exceptions. And one treaty that it didn't, at the time, of course, it simply didn't conceive that it would ever be sued on the basis of that treaty, is the Genocide Convention, which Israel was among the first countries to ratify in the world. And so it's basically a convention that, in a way, acknowledges the victimhood of the Jewish people as victims of genocide. By the way, the United States has ratified the treaty, but it reserved the jurisdictional clause. So the United States cannot be sued under the Genocide Convention, but when Israel joined, it didn't add the reservation, and therefore other countries like South Africa could bring a case to Israel under the Genocide Convention. Should Israel participate or not? My position as a lawyer is that unless you're talking about an extreme case of injustice and lack of fair trial, you should try to defend yourself whenever you can, wherever you can. And the International Court of Justice maybe is not the most hospitable forum for Israel to be here, but I mean, it is composed of serious lawyers. Many of them come from countries with strong independent tradition. The former president of the court even teaches here this semester in Berkeley, Professor Donahue. And I think there is no reason for Israel to boycott those proceedings because there is a lot at stake here. If Israel loses the case and will be branded as a genociding state, it's going to be a very devastating blow to Israel's reputation. And the trick is that you do not appear, and then if the decision comes against you, you say, well, but I didn't participate in the proceedings. The history books normally don't remember this fact. Okay, this is like a side comment. It's a footnote. It's not the main. So I think it's important for Israel to try it, and it was actually very important also because this was a case that was brought in real time while the war was still going on, and Israel was very concerned that if the court would issue what are like injunctions, provisional measures, ordering it to stop the war, it could have significant repercussions, for instance, on its ability to receive military aid from many countries around the world. So there were also very concrete military stakes here. This is why Israel participated. The ICC is a bit of a different story. The International Criminal Court, like you said, Masua, is not part of the UN, but it does have a certain relationship to the United Nations and even to the Security Council of the United Nations. And here, as you know, there have been complaints, allegations brought against Israeli leaders, and the prosecutor of the court, Karim Khan, had issued in May 2024 requests for arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. And the court last November accepted these requests and issued arrest warrants. This is a very serious and very negative development for Israel, not only for those two individuals, because it brands the policies that they have led on behalf of Israel as criminal policies. I should say that the court, I mean, this is a very small comfort, but the prosecution didn't ask for a genocide indictment. So at least at that level, we are still talking we are applying legal categories in a little bit more careful manner than in some other arenas where labels are being very liberally disseminated. But I mean, it's of course a very problematic development, even for the very prosaic reason that Netanyahu cannot travel around the world now because he might be arrested if he sets foot in any of the 124 countries that are parties to the Rome Statute, although some countries in Europe have said that we are not going to implement that decision, which we will see if that happens. Just to remind you that yesterday the former president of the Philippines was arrested and sent to The Hague. So it's not something you would want to test in a legal case. So I don't expect Netanyahu to travel much. Not that I'm too concerned on that specific grounds, but it is for the state. It's a very embarrassing and a very difficult. So they have to fight it, and they are fighting it. And Israel did participate in the proceedings as to challenge the jurisdiction of the court. But they're not going to cooperate with the actual proceedings. They're not going to extradite Netanyahu. So they are trying to basically derail the proceedings with the best lawyerly capabilities that they have.
How do you think that the administrative policies of the U.S. and the new government in the U.S. affect the UN and the way that it operates?
Well, I mean, I don't want to. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to put my. I don't want to interject too much in domestic U.S. affairs, and I'm sure people around the room have strong opinions about this administration. But the United States, and I would say it's not only this administration, in fairness. The United States has been going on a unilateral track for a number of years. One example, which is not actually related directly to the UN, but it's in the same neighborhood of themes we've discussed, that already during the Obama years, the United States blocked the appointment of judges in the World Trade Organization, which is the principal international body that deals with international trade. So this idea of unilateralism, of course, there are various degrees, and this administration is much more, I think, enamored by unilateralism than previous administrations. But there is, I think, a certain trend, and now it is accelerating. And of course, if all countries operate unilaterally, we don't have a world order. And the UN is a reflection of what states want. And if states don't want to cooperate, and if states don't adhere to the basic rules of the system, use of force, peaceful resolution of disputes, cooperation, self-determination, then we don't have, I mean, there is no raison d'etre for that organization to exist. Now, add to that the US is also threatening, it's already withdrawing from some agencies. So we have seen with the Human Rights Council, which the UN withdrew from, although it is not a member of. So this is quite an interesting withdrawal. But I guess it means that they will not participate even as observers in the meetings of the Human Rights Council. They withdrew from the World Health Organization. And of course, there are those who are now emulating. So now there's been a motion in Israel by some politicians that Israel should also withdraw from the World Health Organization. We have seen before withdrawal from UNESCO, which is the education and science branch of the UN. So the fact that the most important, the biggest superpower, the most important country in many areas is basically extricating itself from important elements of the UN and the international system is not boding well for that system. Add to that also the issue of financial contributions, which the UN is withdrawing from certain agencies and is also talking about reducing the overall UN contributions, US contributions to the UN. Add to that sanctions that are being applied against the ICC. This all does, I mean, I don't want to sound as a doomsayer, but it doesn't look good for the continued operation of international organizations.
In general, not
in
just
general, not just the UN, but the UN is in a way this is the, as I said, this is the closest thing that we have to a world government, and if it falls, then we will find ourselves in a state of growing anarchy in international relations.
Even when this world government is not perfect, as probably most of our governments are not perfect. Another question here, or a few questions, actually, ask that you reflect on the relationship between domestic issues in Israel and domestic policies in Israel, and then its action, Israel's action on the international level. One example of this is the vote where Israel voted with the U.S. In the resolution, regarding Ukraine and Russia. Can you speak a bit on that?
Well, this lecture is about Israel and the UN relationship. I did notice that you probably need also a lecture on Israel and US relationship. And your question is really about the Israel-US relationship. And Israel is, look, I mean, when it comes to UN bodies, Israel would always follow the United States. It really, in that regard, it has no... So you see that in a number of resolutions. I mean, for instance, you have the resolutions on Cuba, where the United States every year is being criticized for its embargo on Cuba. And you normally have 3 or 4 countries voting against, which would be the United States, the Marshall Islands, maybe Micronesia, and Israel. So this is, because Israel is so reliant on the US support, especially in the Security Council, it is unfathomable for Israel not to vote with the United States when the US requests it to do so. So this is not a matter of actually of domestic politics. It's a matter of these are the rules of the game for small countries that are completely dependent for diplomatic support by a large country. And in the same way, you know, the Russians have their own groups of states that would always vote in their side. So Nicaragua would also always vote with Russia on these sort of issues, as would Belarus. So I guess this is the parallel. So this doesn't have, I think it doesn't have much to do with domestic politics. Having said that, I would say that the resolution was shameful, both for Israel and for the United States. I mean, the resolution was shameful.
I see a few questions here that are asking, following some of the comments around the UN model as being in a crisis. Can you think, have we outgrown this current model? Can you think of an alternative that would be better, or and even if it is it realistic?
No. No, but I will say, I mean, there have been attempts over the years to create subgroups like leagues of democracies and the like. But then, of course, you get to the question, to the thorny question is, A, what is a democracy? And B, you still need to cooperate with all the others. I mean, you trade with the others. I mean, COVID also implicates the others. Climate change implicates the others. So you need a global organization for states to come around and discuss. There is, I think, a very serious question now what to do with global companies. And I think this, so you talked a little bit about the non-state actors, but you were thinking more about, I think, those, you know, the Hamas and Hezbollahs of the world, which I'm not sure I want to give a sit around the table in terms of global governance, but we do have, I think, a serious question about what to do with companies that are too large and too global to regulate. So they are now operating as, some are operating as small superpowers. Some are also involved in the use of force. So the Ukraine war, Microsoft is extremely active on the Ukraine side in order in providing defensive capacities in the field of cyber war. So you do have now these companies not only influencing, you could say more than influencing the economy and the technology and, you know, freedom of expression, because what our ability to speak on social media freely is now determined by the rules of Meta or by Elon Musk or what have you. But they're also increasingly also generating technology that has international peace and security implications, be they drones, AI that can operate military operations, military systems. So I think there are, this is where I would say our current system is still not, is becoming increasingly, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but increasingly deficient, because we have this powerful group of stakeholders and interest holders that are not well represented by states. And actually what is happening now in this country with, I mentioned Elon Musk, having people who come from technology are also very influential in the governance of states. This is really, I think, accentuating the question. The problematic that we are no longer sure who is running whom, whether it's the state that is running the technology companies or the technology companies that are running the states.
A major theme around behind the scenes to a lot of this conversation is trust. You have to have trust in those institutions. You have to, in order for them to be effective, and the institutions also have to. This is both sides need to have trust in each other. So maybe I'll try to combine two questions, and I think we'll end with this. If you don't have trust, you also mentioned that there are, Israel's not perfect, there are issues that involve human rights and the breach of international law. And at the same time, there is definitely a lack of trust in the ability of the UN and the international organization or the international community to be able to be a fair actor in this. So would you want, in this state of situation, would you want the international community or the UN to call out Israel when it's breaching international law? And what would restore trust or faith in the UN when we're in this situation?
No, I agree with the assumption that we do have a problem of trust. I'm afraid that we have a problem of trust across the board. It's not just with regard to international governance. We have also very serious problems of trust with regard to national governance. And I think we are living in an era where trust is a commodity that is in increasingly high demand and low supply. So this is really, I would say this is a very important issue. I would want international bodies to call out violations of international law, yes, because if we don't, we teach it in law school, we teach it our students that we have to name and we have to claim and sometimes we have to shame. And in international law, shaming actually is important because, like I said, the UN doesn't have, generally speaking, doesn't have enforcement powers. So it's going to be, so if it has any authority, claim for authority, it's mostly moral authority. It speaks on behalf of the international community. But I agree that at this point in time, it's very difficult to see how this works. When you have first these concerns about bias, you have bodies of the UN who appear to be biased in the sense, not that they're calling out Israel. It's fine, and Israel deserves to be called out many times. But they're doing this on a very frequent basis, which is in disproportion to the ways in which other states are being called out. And also using, like I said before, interpretations of the law which are not solid. They're often very tendentious, and they often use very hyperbolic vocabulary. So when you have this combination of what appears to be bias in outcome and also lack of professionalism in process and in the actual application of law, I would say that it probably does more harm than good. That you are basically invoking international law because you're harming international law. You're basically exploiting international law and rendering international law just another political football that you throw from one side of the court to the other. So I think that if the UN, and I think we do want, I want the UN to succeed. I think we need the UN to succeed. It has to undertake some reforms, not so much in terms of necessarily in terms of the structure, but in terms of how it's taking more seriously its charter/constitutional obligations, and is working harder to regain trust, because we are at a very large deficit in that regard.
So with that closing words and the urge to have an organization that is important for world government and for the relations between states, but also acknowledging the crisis that we're at, please join me with thanking Professor Yuval Shany for joining us. Thank you to the Levitsky Family Foundation for this conversation, and to the Moderator.